Thank you very much. It's fantastic to be here and a great honour to be speaking, to be honest with you, in front of a poster of Shahidul Alam. I didn't really know much about him before his arrest. I know that he's not just an adjunct professor here, but he has a very strong connection also with my own university, with the University of Queensland. And he is in a lot of ways an exemplar of the kinds of things that I'll be speaking about. We've just heard a lot about his extraordinary work, but also I think the reasons why he's in prison are things that I'm going to touch on this evening. But the one thing before I really begin the talk is to underline just how important the campaigning really is. I know, as someone who has spent quite a bit of time behind bars, just how important those messages, those tweets really are. One of the things I really came to understand was the power of public pressure. I wouldn't be here today if it weren't for the public campaign that lined up behind me and my two colleagues. Each tweet that we send out doesn't feel like very much, and in truth it isn't. But the Free AJ Staff hashtag got 3 billion impressions, billion with a B. Now that kind of pressure, that kind of social media campaign is undeniable, and that pressure proved to be irresistible. We were released when the public pressure to get us out overcame the internal political domestic pressure to keep us in. And believe me, that had to be some pretty serious pressure. Now, as I said, each one of those tweets isn't on its own a great deal, but we would never reach that 3 billion number if it weren't for people constantly tweeting and taking part in the campaign. And as someone who was inside prison, I also know just how important that recognition is and that support is from people outside, because you know that you are being supported, but you also know that you have come to represent something bigger than yourself. And so I urge everybody to get behind the Free Shahidul Alam hashtag, do what you can, keep speaking about it and keep campaigning. Right, let's talk about the war on journalism. Look, I know that this is going to sound a little bit hyperbolic, but I don't think it is when you start to understand what lies behind the war on journalism. When you see the trends, when we step back a little bit and look at the way things have happened over the recent years, you start to see something really quite disturbing. Now, quite a few organisations have been tracking what's been happening to journalists over recent years, and Freedom House and the RSF are two of those, Reporters Sans Frontières. And RSF, I think, described last year, I think it was Freedom House that described last year as the worst since the beginning of this century for freedom of speech. So what's been going on? Well, look, let's just have a look at some of the figures here. This is the state of press freedom in 1991. You'll see that the green areas are those areas of the world that Freedom House judges to have free press, a genuinely free press. The yellow areas are those with some problems, they're partly free. The purple areas are those areas that Freedom House says are patently not free. And although it's quite hard to see it, there are a few areas that are hashed in black, which are the worst of the worst. And on this particular map, they were in Afghanistan and Somalia. So this was a state of press freedom in 1995. Watch what happens as we change through the years. They updated these maps every 5 years. This is 2000, and you can see the way that purple stain has spread right across into Africa, and a lot of those areas that were green have now since turned back into yellow, the partly free areas. In 2005, we saw a bit of a resurgence, particularly across sub-Saharan Africa and West Africa, and that was encouraging. But we also saw a lot of the yellow areas, the partly free areas, turn purple. 2010, those gains across Africa had disappeared, and the partly free and the purple stains remain stubborn. You'll also notice, by the way, that by 2010, areas of Western Europe, that we thought would be bastions of freedom of speech, part of the European Union, are also got yellow splodges. By 2015, we see those areas in Latin America, in Africa, all disappear, and the purple stains spread even further. So, let's have another look at another graph that I think is starting to support the numbers here. This is from the CPJ, the Committee for the Protection of Journalists, and you'll see the grey areas are those areas of the world where journalists have been arrested. And this is from last year, 2017. The red spots, the red dots, are those areas, those countries where journalists have been killed. And the broad shape of it, you can see, more or less reflects what we saw in the Freedom House map. The areas across Asia, Latin America, Asia, Middle East, and North Africa, with a few problem spots in Latin America. So what's going on? Why have things changed? Why are things getting bad? Well, there's another couple of sets of statistics that I think are going to help with this. And forgive me with the PowerPoints, by the way. I should have said this earlier. I've started to learn as an academic that you can't really call yourself an academic unless you come up with a PowerPoint presentation. Believe me, yeah, I know. I can't stand them myself, so forgive me. But there is a couple of other sets of statistics that I think help illuminate things. This is a map showing a graph showing those journalists that were killed since the CPJ, the Committee for the Protection of Journalists, started keeping the numbers back in 1992. And you'll see that over the right here, you'll see a bit of a surge through the early 1990s. Then it falls off through the late 90s, and then it starts to creep up again, or shoot up again in the early 2000s, staying consistently fairly high until the last couple of years when they dropped off a little bit. The numbers I want to stress here that are being used by the CPJ are very, very conservative. The CPJ uses a very narrow definition of what counts as a journalist, and the numbers that they use for these graphs only refer to journalists who've been killed where we know exactly what the motives were, where those motives were tied directly to their work. It doesn't count those that may have been killed in a car accident, perhaps, or who were killed perhaps in incidental gunfire. It might have been deliberate, it may not have been. These are journalists that we know have been killed for their work. And the numbers through the late 1990s reached about 79 in this particular case. Sorry, in the 2000s, the mid-2000s. You'll see that's in 2007 that they hit 79. So the thing I want to draw your attention to is the shape of the graph, the overall shape. What we saw in the early 1990s were those surges that were due to the wars that we saw in Rwanda, in Somalia, and in Bosnia, that's right, where journalists, local journalists themselves, were often casualties in these really brutal, bitter civil conflicts, ethnic conflicts, where your own ethnicity would make you a target regardless of your own integrity, your own professional integrity. Through the late 90s, they tailed off, and then they started to creep up. Let me have a look at, I'll show you another set of statistics that I think also help us here. That's this map, this graph showing those journalists who are imprisoned. Again, broadly similar kind of shape to the overall thing. Early 1990s, a bit of a surge, it tails off through the late 90s, and then it starts to creep up to the 2000s until last year, the last couple of years, which were records. 262 journalists that were imprisoned as of December 31st of 2017. So, why? What changed? The numbers started going up around 2002, 2003. I think that we can locate the one thing that everybody associates with 2001, and that's 9/11, the war on terror. I think this is a really crucial point because let's think about what happened during the wars pre-9/11, a lot of the conflicts pre-9/11, like Bosnia, Rwanda, Somalia and elsewhere, where we saw conflicts that were largely over tangible things, over stuff, things that you could put your finger on. And in those kinds of conflicts, journalists are observers, often inconvenient observers. That's not to say that we weren't targets at various points, but those were generally because of the work that we were doing. When you showed up and you exposed something that somebody wanted to keep hidden, a warlord perhaps wanted to keep a massacre out of the view of the cameras, then you were at great risk. Those early wars were also the kinds of conflicts where a lot of freelancers got caught up in the violence because we weren't really aware of just how serious those conflicts were and the kind of training and equipment that we needed. But after 9/11, what happened? I think Afghanistan is really instructive. I was a correspondent in Kabul in 1995. And as a correspondent, what we would do was cross the front lines with impunity. I felt that as a journalist, I had not just a professional responsibility to cross the lines, I also felt it was important for my own security. I felt that I needed to maintain my professional integrity so that both sides understood my role as an observer. I knew that as a white, clean-shaven guy on the front lines of Afghanistan who was working around those front lines, that sooner or later someone on the other side would see me through their rifle sights. And what I did not want was for that person on the other side to feel that they had a reason to pull the trigger. And so I needed to make sure that in crossing the front lines, both sides understood my neutrality, that I posed no threat to either side, that I was a genuinely neutral observer to what was going on. And we could do that in those kinds of wars over things, over stuff, whether it's ethnicity or land or water or political power. But 9/11 changed everything. It was no longer a war over things, but it was a war over ideas. And in that conflict of ideas, the place where ideas are transmitted, in other words, the media, becomes a part of the battle space. And this is not, as we've seen from these statistics, this is not an abstract academic idea. This is something that has had real, brutal consequences. I remember in Afghanistan, I was covering the war after 9/11, and soon after the war against the Taliban really stepped up with the support of the Americans and their allies backing the Northern Alliance. Al Jazeera got the one interview that I'd wager every journalist in the world would have wanted at that particular time, and that was with Osama bin Laden. They broadcast that interview, and they were accused and criticised very, very heavily by the politicians right across the West, and particularly in the United States, and they were accused of aiding and abetting terrorist ideology, transmitting terrorist ideology. Al Jazeera said that it was simply doing its job in interrogating all sides, all of the parties to the conflict, which I would argue is a fair explanation of the things that we are supposed to be doing. But an American bomb in November, as the Allies, as the Northern Alliance was advancing on Kabul, an American bomb fell squarely on the Al Jazeera bureau. Now, the Americans initially insisted it was a mistake, but they later acknowledged that they had targeted what they considered to be a known terrorist facility, a place that was harbouring terrorists. About the same time, about a month later, there was a convoy carrying a group of journalists, including an extraordinary Italian journalist who I was very, very close to, Maria Grazia Catulli, and a wonderful Australian cameraman, Harry Burton. The Taliban intercepted that convoy. They dragged the journalists out of the convoy. They let everybody else go. They pulled the journalists into the hills outside Sorobi, just to the east of Kabul, and they emptied the magazines of their Kalashnikovs into them. Now we know from after those guys were arrested and finally convicted of the murders, that they were acting on orders from their Taliban superiors to go explicitly after journalists. Now this is disturbing for me in particular because back in 1995, the group that was laying siege to Kabul, the group that we would cross the front lines to talk to, was the Taliban. And so things had changed. All of a sudden, the Americans were dropping bombs on news organisations that were broadcasting things that they felt were unpalatable. And the Taliban too were going after journalists simply because they were journalists. These journalists were the first to be killed explicitly because of who they were, rather than because of anything in particular that they were doing or because they were caught in the crossfire. What the war on terror did was it made the conflict a binary choice. George W. Bush, in a now famous speech before the joint session of Congress after 9/11, said that in this war, you are either with us or you're with the terrorists. Now what he did was made it impossible for journalists to do our jobs and interrogate both sides of the conflict without crossing that ideological line, that rhetorical line that he drew very clearly. You're either with us or you're with the terrorists. So any journalist that was doing their jobs and interrogating both sides, in trying to understand what motivated and drove the extremists, was accused of broadcasting or transmitting terrorist ideology. This is a very serious problem. It has given license to governments the world over to use national security as a way of going after anybody that challenges what they consider to be the security of the nation. A friend of mine once joked, only half joking, that the war on terror is a war on an abstract noun. It means whatever anybody wants it to mean. It's a fungible term. It's malleable. I'd wager that if I gave everyone in this room a piece of paper and a pen and asked you all to write down your definitions of terrorism, there are probably about 180, 200 people here at the moment. I reckon that if I collected all of those pieces of paper, I would wind up with about 200 different definitions of it. Most of them would probably agree around the centre of what terrorism might look like, but invariably we would wind up with all sorts of fuzzy edges to the term. And it's that malleability that has allowed governments the opportunity to redefine it in ways that suit any of them. And this is what happened to us in Egypt. You see, I was working in Cairo at the end of 2013, covering the unfolding political crisis there, working, frankly, in a way that I'm not especially proud of. I've done a lot of work that I am proud of. But as anybody who's worked as a journalist in any particular region for a time knows, the more time you spend on a story, the more you get a sense of where the edges are. And you know, when you start to probe those edges, the point at which you can start to expect some pushback from the authorities. Now, I've done that plenty of times before in those places where I've spent a lot of time, like Afghanistan, like Africa, sub-Saharan Africa. I know the Congo, I know Somalia, I know Kenya, I know South Sudan very well, and I've pushed the boundaries there. But Egypt was not one of those places. I'd only been in country for a couple of weeks. I was treading water covering the Bureau over the Christmas-New Year period. And so I didn't really understand the story well enough to be able to start pushing those boundaries. I was doing what I'd consider to be vanilla journalism. The government would make a statement about some changes it was making to the Constitution, and I'd pick up the phone and call the opposition for a response, and then find an analyst to make sense of it all. It was vanilla journalism. Just so happens, though, that the opposition at the time, the classic model of democracy, the opposition is usually considered to be the party that was last in power and who can reasonably be expected to be the next government in waiting. Well, at the time, that was the Muslim Brotherhood. They had won the first democratic elections in Egypt's history in the middle of 2012, and in 2013 they were ousted in a popular uprising backed by the military, and the military stepped in and said to the Brotherhood, "We think you should obey the democratic will of the people," There are all these demonstrations in the streets and you need to step down. And by the way, here's a gun to your head to make sure that you do that. At the time that we were working, the Brotherhood had been accused by the government of being involved in acts of terror, but it hadn't been banned, and it was still undeniably the most potent political force in the country, the best organised political force in the country, and it was the opposition. But it turns out that speaking to the Brotherhood in the view of the government was an act of terror. Remember what we were charged with: aiding and abetting a terrorist organisation, financing a terrorist organisation, being members of a terrorist organisation, broadcasting false news to undermine national security. I'm not sure how many convicted terrorists you guys have had here in front of you, but that's where I stand at the moment. And I struggled to come to terms with those charges for a very long time. I really couldn't comprehend how anybody could reconcile the very vanilla journalism that we had been doing with the very radical charges of terrorism that we were facing. That gap was just too wide for me to see how that had happened. Nobody that I felt could reasonably take the reality of what we're doing, the evidence of what we've been doing, and reach those conclusions, those charges. And a friend of mine said, look, this is one of my cellmates, a guy called Allah Abdel Fattah, who is one of the most extraordinary characters I've ever met, and he said, you need to stop thinking about the facts of what you did and start thinking about the politics of what happened. And I remember one day down the basement of the National Intelligence Directorate, they've got what they call, they've got literally a dungeon. Each day after we were arrested, we'd be taken to this holding cell, a concrete holding cell in the basement of the National Intelligence Directorate. And what would happen was when your interrogator was ready to speak to you, he'd send down a guard and the guard would call your name and you'd go to the bars of the holding cell and you'd put your hand through and he'd cuff you and then he'd lead you up. And this guard came down, he called my name, Mr. Peter Greste, and I sort of came, I gave him my hands and he cuffed me. And he's leading me up, and as he's leading me up, he turns and he says, so, Mr. Peter, where are you from? And I said, oh, mate, I'm from Australia. And he goes, Australia, welcome in Egypt. It's like, thanks, mate. Yeah, really looking forward to seeing the pyramids sometime. and I really struggle with this. And the reason I tell you this story was that not because I wanted to say how sarcastic or cynical this guy was, but because it was a genuine instinctive response from a man who was only showing genuine Egyptian hospitality, Middle Eastern hospitality. And anybody who's worked in the area, who's travelled through the area, will understand just how extraordinarily rich that is. So he didn't see me as a threat. He didn't see me as a terrorist. And I started to understand that I was there not because of anything I had done, but because of what I'd come to represent. And that was press freedom. That we were in prison because the authorities wanted to make it abundantly clear that any journalist who dared to speak to the Muslim Brotherhood, whether you're locals or foreigners, was going to find themselves in deep, deep trouble. There's one other graph I want to show that I think underscores the problem I'm trying to talk about here. That's this one. This is a graph showing the charges that the journalists were facing at the end of 2017. You'll see that yellow quarter up there, that's other or no charges. Those are the charges that you'd expect journalists to be imprisoned for, things like defamation, for slander, the sorts of crimes of journalism such as they are. And there's an overlap of a number of journalists that are charged on multiple counts. But all of those, that vast 2/3 sorry, 3/4 of that pie chart that's marked in red are journalists who have been charged on anti-state charges, like terrorism, like sedition, like treason, the sorts of things that Shahidul Alam is facing. 3/4 of all the journalists who are imprisoned around the world, that record number of 262 that, by the way, has only gone up since the beginning of this year, as Turkey in particular has gone on a bit of a jailing spree. It's the idea that you can start imprisoning journalists on national security grounds that I find deeply disturbing. Now, to be fair, I think a lot of governments genuinely believe that they're doing the right thing. I don't mean to be patronising here, I don't mean to be overly generous to my hosts in Egypt, but I think they felt that we were genuine threats to the state, which is a deeply troubling development. They said that they never imprisoned journalists for their journalism. We weren't there because we had done something with our reporting, that we'd been loose or sloppy with our reporting. As far as the government was concerned, we were there because we were terrorists. This is not a rhetorical slip. In their eyes, we represented genuine threats to the stability of the state. Turkey, the world's greatest jailer of journalists at the moment, has, I think, about 1/4, is it, of all of the world's journalists, or is it about 1/3, I think, of all of the world's journalists? Most of them are on terrorism charges. If you go and speak to the Gulenist movement, the group that the Turkish authorities accused of being behind the coup from a few years ago, you publish those remarks, then chances are you'll find yourself in prison on terrorism charges. But it's not just these kinds of authoritarian regimes like Turkey, like North Korea, like the Russians, who are also fairly big jailers of journalists, or Egypt. It's also in a lot of these other countries that we would consider to be bastions of freedom of speech. Take the United States. I'm a big fan of Barack Obama's. I think he's one of the most underrated presidents the US has had, but his record is not particularly encouraging when it comes to press freedom. The US has the Espionage Act that was written into law in 1914. And it was designed pretty much to do what it says. It was designed to put in prison spies who were trying to uncover national security secrets on behalf of foreign agents. From 1914 until 2008, it was used a total of 5 times. Barack Obama, from 2008 until 2016, used it more often than all of his predecessors combined. And in almost every case, it was either going after journalists or their sources. Now, again, you could understand this if those journalists and their sources were exposing national security secrets. But in almost every case, that was not what was happening. The government was going after journalists who were revealing things that were fundamentally politically embarrassing. What about Australia? Well, as much as we like to consider ourselves as bastions of free speech and democratic principles, Western liberalism and so on, classic liberalism, we have, particularly recently, a rather disturbing record of using our own national security legislation to limit the space that journalists are able to do. Think about Section 35P of the ASIO Act, which allows the minister to declare any domestic security operation an SIO, a special intelligence operation. When something is declared an SIO, we cannot even report that that SIO exists, much less any details of the particular operation. Now, I understand the need to maintain security and secrecy, particularly when it deals with ASIO officers. I know one very senior ASIO officer who is insisting that the law is there to try and protect their agents when they have to break the law in the course of their duty. For example, if they have to carry drugs, if they're trying to penetrate some kind of drug smuggling operation, perhaps they need to buy drugs because they need to work undercover. and I understand that. But to me, it's deeply concerning when a suppression order becomes so wide, so deep, that we have no way of being able to report even when things go drastically wrong years after the event, because an SIO exists in perpetuity until the minister decides that it's appropriate to lift that SIO. And of course, we know that if things go wrong, they're not going to lift it. There's the foreign fighters legislation, which makes it an offence to broadcast or publish terrorist ideology. News.com.au earlier this year released very briefly a story about how Islamic extremists were using online trading websites like Gumtree as a way of organising and recruiting members. That was taken down under the foreign fighters legislation because they were accused of broadcasting or publishing terrorist ideology. They eventually won the case, but not before it had disappeared offline. I would argue that that is the kind of thing that we as informed members of the public need to know and understand. What about the data? Oh, one other aspect of the foreign fighter legislation, which I think is particularly germane to me. It gives the minister the power. In fact, there's an automatic component, so that if you are if you are a dual national, and you are found or deemed to be operating, to be working in areas that the government has decided is an area where terrorists are active, then you can automatically have your Australian nationality revoked. Well, guess what? I'm both Latvian and Australian. I've worked in Afghanistan, in Iraq, in Somalia, in Sudan, most of the countries that are deemed to have been places where terrorism is taking place, and I have a terrorism conviction. Now, the minister said, when I raised this with Julie Bishop while she was foreign minister, she said, look, you're not the kind of person, don't be silly, we're not going to take it from you. And I accept that I'm not suggesting that I am someone who they will be taking my Australian nationality from. But the point is that there are many others like me who, if they start doing work that becomes inconvenient for the government, then I promise you it will be used at some point in future. Data retention legislation is another thing that I'm deeply concerned about. Now remember, the data retention legislation compels the telecommunications companies to hang on to the metadata of every Australian for at least 2 years. A whole host of government agencies can investigate the metadata of any Australian without a warrant, with one exception. After some arguments from the press, the government acknowledged that it was inappropriate for them to go and dig into a journalist's metadata for looking for sources because of the need to protect the integrity of the journalist's work. So they introduced these special courts. But guess what? If you are a source of a journalist's work, or if the government is investigating the source of a journalist's work in some kind of department that they feel is uncomfortable or threat to national security, then the sources have no such protection. The government insisted this was because it was necessary for national security. They said that they would only use it in cases of national security. Well, we know through court documents that Border Force has used metadata to look into the sources of the leaks from Manus and Nauru, the conditions on those islands. Now, whatever you think of the rights or wrongs of that policy, the offshore detention policy, and I'm not here to get into a debate about that. Whatever you think of the rights or wrongs of that policy, it's hard to argue that that was a case of national security. Politically embarrassing? Absolutely. National security? I don't think so. More recently, of course, we know that the AFP have been called in to investigate the source of leaks from Peter Dutton's office into Au Pair Gate. Was that a breach of national security? Or was it important work of journalists and their sources to expose something that we all ought to know about? One of the things that gets lost in this debate is the relationship that we are supposed to have with our politicians. See, I'm absolutely convinced that the politicians are serious when they draft this legislation, that they genuinely are concerned about national security. Because no politician wants to say, listen, I'm sorry, I think there's rather serious overreach here. And then a week later find that there's another Lint Cafe siege, for example, where immediately their credibility is shot because they're accused of being weak on national security and exposing Australians, risking Australian lives for some pompous or pious ideal about human rights. But the thing is that in a functioning democracy, what happens is that we hire them. We are their employers. We forget this sometimes, particularly in the way that they speak to us. They're accountable to us, and as their employers, we have a responsibility to know what politicians and the government is doing in our names. The way in which we do this is with a responsible, vigorous, vibrant, free press that has the capacity to interrogate the government, except in a narrow set of circumstances. Now again, please understand, I'm not saying that there's any grand conspiracy here. I'm not suggesting that Australia is about to become Egypt anytime soon. But I am concerned that in our drive, in our politicians' drive to make us safe, to introduce all of these pieces of national security legislation to cope with this changing, shifting environment, which I understand completely, but in our rush to make us safe, what we're doing is undermining the very system that has made us one of the safest and most prosperous places on the planet. Ladies and gentlemen, there is a fantastic concept called the grey zone. A few years ago, an organisation started talking about the grey zone in a democracy. And by the grey zone, what they meant was the space that makes a pluralist, multicultural society like Australia's possible. It's the sort of thing that actually means that I can come up and speak to you and criticise the government and not get shut down. The grey zone is that space that allows us to have public debate, to have disagreements without winding up killing each other, where we can have left and right, where we can have Muslims and Christians and Jews and all sorts of other religious groups operating and living comfortably side by side, without fear of breaking out into civil war. It's absolutely essential to a functioning democracy. Does anyone know what organisation came up with the term or used the term? Amnesty International, perhaps, some democracy think tank. It was Islamic State, that's right, it was ISIS. A few years ago they published a front page in their online magazine called The Beak, in which they called for the extinction of the grey zone. Because for ISIS what they want is a binary state, where it's impossible for Muslims and Christians to live alongside one another, where you're either with them, the Muslims, or not. And in this article, curiously enough, they quoted one man very prominently in support of their cause. The man they quoted was George W. Bush, and the line was, yes, you guessed it, in this war on terror you are either with us or you're with the terrorists. A binary choice. So what I'm saying is, what I'm urging is that we all remember what we're giving up when we allow these kinds of draconian pieces of legislation to slip forward, to slip into our laws, into our legal system. I understand that the press has a responsibility here. I understand that it has not been doing its job as fully as it should be, that in our rush to be viable, in our rush to try and stay alive and stay afloat, we've often allowed our standards to slip. Never wrong for long is a slogan that we sometimes joke about over a beer. We can't afford to do that because we need to maintain public trust. We need to win back a lot of the public trust, not maintain it, but win it back, to recover it. Because we're not going to be able to survive and make the argument if we are not able to have public confidence in the work that we do as journalists. But I also want to remind everyone of the line from a French philosopher, Albert Camus, who said that a free press can, of course, be both good and bad, But a press that is not free can never be anything but bad. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks, Peter. That was inspiring as always. Debbie Lowe, I teach in global studies here. What can we do at the moment in Australia? Press freedoms are just being increasingly tightened. What can we do? What are the actions we can take?
Okay, well, I think this is not going to happen overnight. We can't sort of simply go out and march and have everything change. I think what we need to do, particularly as academics, and it's actually something that I'm starting to work on at the moment. I'm setting up a research agenda dealing very explicitly with these kinds of questions, trying to understand the impact and quantify the impact that a lot of national security legislation has had on the work of journalists. So we need to keep pushing with that sort of research, with that kind of work that helps us uncover and understand in a very real and tangible way just what we're losing in this kind of environment. But we also need to keep making the case and talking to friends and colleagues more broadly in the community. It's never going to simply happen organically. We need to keep writing about it, keep tweeting about it. Again, I know that sounds a little bit lame. I know people often want something much more solid, much more direct and explicit, but I keep going back to that campaign that got us out of prison. You know, it's just that kind of relentless swell of public opposition. Because I genuinely believe that while the public understands, or public is generally pretty cynical and fed up with what they're seeing in the papers these days, that if we remind Australians what our world would look like without a free press, if our world starts to look more like Egypt and Turkey and less like Australia, more like North Korea, God forbid, then they'd understand what it is that we're risking losing at the moment. And I think we might see some pushback. And so I think we just need to start making that case more publicly. One, come to you in a minute.
Hi Peter, it's an honour to hear you speak. I just had a question about public trust in journalism.
Mm-hmm.
How do you think we can win back the trust of the public?
Oh, that's not particularly complicated. By sticking to our ethics and standards. I mean, I don't mean that facetiously. Look, I understand the problem for journalists, for news organisations. The fact is, and I was at the Navigating the News conference in Hobart, where there was an extraordinary panel with Nicholas Gray from News Corp and Lisa Davies from the Sydney Morning Herald and Gavin Morris from the ABC, all sitting together on the same panel, and remarkably they didn't end up punching each other. And the thing, I was speaking to them afterwards, and the thing that we all agreed on was that news as a commodity doesn't pay on its own, it never has. And that the things that make news commercially successful are the polar opposite, are pulling news in the polar opposite direction from the things that you actually need to have quality journalism and the things that you need to be able to have a properly informed democracy. But the problem is that unless we resist those pressures, unless we are prepared to slow down some of the news and we're not published until we're absolutely sure that we're right, unless we resist the instincts to sex up headlines because they're going to generate more clicks, they're going to be more appealing to the algorithms, we're never really going to be able to win back public trust. It's not rocket science, it's not brain surgery, it's journalism. And yes, journalism is a messy, imperfect human construct, and like all messy, imperfect human constructs, we often get it wrong. But there are principles that are well established. We all know about accuracy, fairness, and balance in our reporting. These things are not hard to do. It's just very it's hard in the current environment. But I like to go back to our case, without wanting to sound arrogant about it or big-headed about it. I know that the Egyptians and their supporters were going through all of my work and the work of my colleagues to try and find something in our records that might have shown that we were loose, that we'd been loose with the truth in the past, or that we'd been particularly biased in supporting one group or another. And if they'd found those stories, they'd have published it and broadcast it from the headline, from the rooftops. And what would have happened is that the public, those people that lined up behind us, all those 3 billion people that tweeted or saw the tweets, would have started to think, maybe these guys were guilty. Maybe that, where there's no smoke without fire. Maybe they were, in fact, messing around with the Brotherhood. If they did this before, then they're perfectly capable of doing it now. And if there'd been doubt, then the politicians wouldn't have supported us, the diplomats would have backed away, and I'd still be in prison. That public trust in our integrity was the thing that got me out of prison. And I think if we can maintain that trust by recovering our commitment to standards and stepping back a little bit from the commercial pressures, then we've got a chance of winning things back. It's very difficult now in the current digital environment to do that because, frankly, if you disagree with what you read in the paper, you'll always find plenty of support online for whatever opinion you happen to hold, no matter how radical it might be. But I think that people generally understand, and we're seeing this in the drift to the legacy media more recently, the New York Times, CNN, BBC and others, particularly all benefiting from the Trump bump. And so people, I think, understand the need for it. We just need to get back to basics.
Hi, Peter, it's Colleen Morrell from Swinburne here.
There you are, Colleen.
Great talk. I suppose I've got just one small comment and then a question. My comment would be, I think we're a lot more aware of this now because it's Western journalists that have had the problems. But it's really important to remember that, journalists are targeted in Mexico, they're targeted in El Salvador.
Well, yeah, and Turkey is the biggest of the lot, and of course we've seen the Reuters journalists in Myanmar, and they're only a small handful of those as well. So
and
yes,
Beirut,
and Beirut, yes.
Correspondents were actually targeted
Yeah,
there.
yeah.
My question was, I know we spoke a bit about this after you were released, and you weren't really able to talk about Al Jazeera. But I wondered if you could now say, was the role of Al Jazeera within Egypt part of your problem?
Al Jazeera English, I don't think was. I mean, remember that I was there only for a couple of weeks, but I know from my own relationship with my editors, and I know from the debates that we had around our coverage, that we were able to do what I'd consider to be work of the highest integrity. We weren't pushed or pulled in any particular direction editorially. Al Jazeera Mubasher, which is Al Jazeera Live, that's the Egyptian branch of Al Jazeera, I think was guilty of, the kind of drift that we've seen in, say, Fox News. I never saw any evidence that Mubasher or Arabic were explicitly working to undermine the government, that were explicitly colluding with the Brotherhood in a way that I think would justify the allegations against us. I do think, though, that they drunk the Kool-Aid, that when you, as anybody does, we're sitting in Australia here, we have an Australian-centric view of the world. We see it through our own local lens, and if you're sitting in London or New York, And if you're sitting in Doha, you tend to get a Qatari-centric view of the world. And we know that Qatar, for a long period through the Arab Spring, was very supportive of a lot of the Brotherhood and their regimes. They said that it was because they were supporting the underdogs. And let's face it, the origins of the Brotherhood were from the underclass. And I think that there was a genuine political culture that built up around seeing the Brotherhood and their supporters as the heroes in this struggle. And I think there was an editorial bias that crept into their work. I don't mean to be making excuses for them. I think that they lost the plot in a lot of ways. And I think that there was, and we complained a lot about a lot of the editorial decisions that were made, and yet they kept on broadcasting things that were, frankly, I think, incendiary. But were they guilty of colluding with the Brotherhood in some underhanded way to destabilise the state? I don't think so. I think they were being aggressively and vigorously critical, but also I think they'd lost their sense of perspective as well. Sorry. Microphone. This way.
Where do you get your news from now?
I think no one can if your news diet, we're all omnivores, and we have to be omnivores. You've got to take it from everywhere. I read the Australian and the Fairfax papers, the ABC, I read The Guardian, I read the New York Times, BBC, The Economist. Those tend to be my go-to news organisations. Mainstream, yes, but also, a range within that mainstream.
Hi, Peter. Thanks for coming to talk to us again. My question was just after your experience in Egypt, what's your advice to someone who wants to start out as a foreign correspondent in a zone like Egypt or Turkey? I could have frustrated.
Honestly, I know it's hard, but I'd say go get work in a regional newsroom. I don't mean that dismissively. Well, there are two things. First of all, for God's sake, get your safety training. There are a whole group of organisations that are subsidising or offering subsidised courses for young freelancers like yourself. Go and do it. Learn about how to look after yourself in a hostile environment from people who've lived and survived hostile environments. Not so much so that you can tell the difference in between the sound of a Kalashnikov and an M16 rifle, but so that you understand the state of mind that you need to take into a hostile environment, so that you understand the attitude that you have to get through. That's really vital. But the reason I say go and work in a regional newsroom is that it's probably the best ground place that you'll have, first of all, to get your basic journalism skills figured out, but also where you learn much more than in a capital city newsroom. You learn how to make stories relevant to people. You learn how to be creative in the way that you get stories. You learn to work very much on your own in isolation in a lot of cases. Those newsrooms can be pretty isolating. You learn a lot of the basic craft skills that you ultimately end up taking into the field when you work as a foreign correspondent. And that's what I did. And honestly, looking back, I think it was some of the best training that I ever had. I started out at GMV6 in Shepparton. We would produce, on some days, I remember producing 5 news pieces, 5 news stories a day. The fastest story I ever turned around we ever shot was, I think, 3.5 minutes from getting out the door, was it 3.5, 4.5 minutes? From pulling up at the car to getting back in the car, we shot the whole story in 4.5 minutes. Because you had to, you sort of learnt to produce things quickly and efficiently, and also and make relatively obscure stories relevant to people.
Hey, so James Ricketson's recently been in the news
Oh gosh, a great deal of anger and disorientation. I'm sure James was like us. We hadn't done anything wrong. We'd broken no laws. We'd done nothing criminal. And we knew that when the trial, through the course of the trial, that the authorities had come up with zero evidence to convict us of anything. And so when it came to sentencing, to the verdict, we were absolutely convinced that we would walk. And we thought, well, at the very worst, we might get a conviction, but we'd already spent 6 months in prison at that time, and we felt that surely time served would be enough. When we were convicted and sentenced to 7 years, that felt like we'd been punched in the guts by Mike Tyson. I remember being utterly winded. I know from some of the footage that I've seen of the verdict afterwards that there was a huge uproar in court. At the time, I just remember nothing. All I remember was silence. My ears were ringing. And I'm pretty sure James is still struggling to come to terms with that idea as well. You know, there was no evidence in his trial either. The only way he's going to survive it, though, is if he comes to terms with being in prison. The thing that will kill you in the end is the desire to get out. That's not to say that you completely capitulate, but you have to accept the reality of the place that you're in, because if you're constantly raging against the walls and the injustice and so on, ultimately it'll kill you, and that's not what you want to do if you're in prison.
Hi, lovely to have you here today. I'm doing postgraduate here at RMIT. As people who are starting out in the industry, I often find in job descriptions it specifically says, demonstrate knowledge of how to get views, how to get clicks, what do people actually want to read, as opposed to public information. How, starting in that industry and wanting to actually get, employment, can we balance that? Because obviously there is light shade journalism, but we don't want to be light 24/7.
Oh gosh, I hate it when I get asked these questions. I don't have an answer for you. I wish I did. I wish there was an easy way of saying that this is an easy solution for you. And particularly when you're starting out, it's a very difficult thing to push back against as well. And I had the luxury of starting my career before all this stuff became an issue. And I worked for news organisations that, frankly, weren't particularly concerned about audience numbers, or at least they were concerned about it, but what really drove the editorial decisions of the day were the news values of the stories we were covering, the editorial values. So I don't have an answer, because I can say to you that you need to look for the human elements, the human angles in stories, and you need to kind of prioritise that and find things that make people, without losing the integrity of your work, find things that tweak people's interests, that get them to click. But ultimately, those kinds of strategies, if you follow them through to their logical conclusion, means that you end up far too often producing tabloid journalism, and that's not what any of us really start in this business for, frankly. So I don't have a ready answer for that. I'm sorry, I wish I did.
Hi Peter. I was just wondering, since your release, have you heard any updates of the colleagues that were in prison with you? And
yeah, they're all out. They were released. What happened? They were pardoned. They were released and pardoned, in fact. It's a bit complicated, but I was released after we appealed our conviction. We had the conviction overturned and a retrial was ordered. And before the retrial could begin, I was removed from the country on a presidential order to serve out, or to have the judicial process completed here in Australia according to Egyptian law. About 2 weeks later, the retrial began, and I was named as a defendant alongside those guys. They were all reconvicted after another 6-month trial. They went back to prison. I was convicted in absentia. After another couple of weeks, they were pardoned and released. And so they're now clear, although I still carry an outstanding prison sentence. But one of them, Fami, is in Canada, working as an activist and academic and a speaker, and Bahar is back at Al Jazeera in Doha.
Oh, hey, sorry. So you spoke a lot about, I guess, domestic policy and national security issues and how that can affect journalists. What about foreign policy? I was just thinking about Cambodia and Australia and Cambodia is doing quite a bit of dealing, so it might be hard to get journalists out of that. So how does foreign policy also affect?
It's a good question. I actually wrote about this in the Saturday paper a few weeks ago. Diplomatic pressure works. It's a very important, well, it doesn't work purely, it's not the only thing that matters, of course, but it's a very big part of the mix. I think diplomats generally prefer to work behind the scenes. They don't like big public displays of frustration or big public displays of anger, but sometimes you need to match the private discussions that you're having with very public positions. And that's what happened to us in Egypt. The Australian government worked, I know DFAT, and I know there's a lot of people who've got criticisms of Julie Bishop, but on my case at least, I think she was fantastic. And they worked behind the scenes very, very vigorously. But Australia has no real diplomatic leverage in Egypt. But when we were finally convicted, Julie Bishop stood up very, very forcefully and said that this was a travesty and an outrage. Our closer neighbours, like the Cambodians, I think when it comes to dealing with them, we need to stand up and stand by our principles. Australia presents itself as a country that stands by the principles of a liberal democracy, freedom of speech, freedom of expression, freedom of the press, basic human rights, due process, rule of law. And if those are the principles that we believe in, then we need to stand by them publicly. And I think in the case of Cambodia, we actually do have leverage. We ought to be using it. I understand why the Australian government was relatively quiet through the trial, because they don't want to be seen to be interfering in the judicial process. But when a trial concludes and there is zero evidence presented in the trial to justify the charges or the sentence, then I think we've got a responsibility to stand up and talk about it, but also use some of the leverage the real leverage, whether it's trade or aid or whatever, that we have.
Hi. I'm not actually very good at asking questions, but thank you for coming here and sharing some of your story with us. I found it particularly fascinating, a point at which you described a large part of the problem being that war was now ideological and being taken into that field, and it reminded me of quite ancient roots with Socrates and the story of Socrates, and kind of that whole idea around ideology and rhetoric, and what of course happened to him when he was trying to be, as it were, an impartial mirror, which is very much the role you describe of your own active career. Along those lines, war and this problem gets heat and momentum through without really any great deep thought, fielding
I think I'm at one level I'm pessimistic because of the rhetorical problem that you speak of, but not just because it's an age-old thing, but because of what the war on terror is. Because the war on terror is unwinnable. It's because it's an abstraction. You can't ever conquer the capital of terror. You can't ever stand on the flight deck of an aircraft carrier with a sign saying victory behind you. You'll never be a moment at which you can declare that you have beaten this thing. And because you can't ever say that we've won it, all of the extraordinary laws and provisions that we've introduced to combat it will be with us pretty much forever. And that concerns me enormously, that rhetorically, because it's an abstraction, it's something that will never properly end, and I think that's deeply concerning. But I am also a great fan of Steve Pinker, who, I don't know if any of you have read his wonderful book called Our Better Angels, in which he takes a long view of history and talks about the way that over the centuries, the numbers of people who've been killed have radically reduced. The numbers of people who live in poverty have radically reduced. The way that human rights, those maps notwithstanding, that over the sweep of human history, and even in the more recent decades, the numbers of the areas of the world that are under conflict, the numbers of people who are dying each year are actually coming down. And I think that even though I can't necessarily see a way out of it, I actually think that that trend is likely to continue. I do still worry about, we're not going to get there if we simply take it for granted, though, and that's why I think we just need to push back and remind ourselves what the war on terror really means and what it's doing to us.
And now I'll just ask Professor French to come up to thank Peter for us.
Of the School of Media and Communication, RMIT and the College of Design and Social Context. Alex has a show bag of things to thank you for coming and talking to us. She's given me a bit of a list. The first person on the list to thank is you. And one of the things that resonates with me really strongly when you're talking to a group which has a lot of students in it is the idea that we're training and educating people who are going to go out into the world and work everywhere, and they're going to work in places where not everybody is equal and free. And we need to think about that as educators, and the idea that when we go out, recently I've been at the Commission for the Status of Women in New York with UNESCO and looking at the safety of women journalists, and in some places there were people presenting there saying that women could get raped in the middle of a busy newsroom. And it's not something that you'd really expect, and that's why you say do your safety course, which I made a note of, that we should make sure our students do that. And also the idea of diversity was something that resonated with me. So I was thinking of the idea that in Egypt they really believed something different to what you believed, and that people think differently, and if you're not exposed to difference and diversity, you can't really understand those other ways of thinking. So thank you so much. Please join me.